Hi, this is Aaron Newcomb for Floss Weekly. This week we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be streaming Randal Schwartz' keynote speech down at FISL. You're going to want to watch this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Floss Weekly is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Floss Weekly with Aaron Newcomb and Randal Schwartz, episode 173, recorded on July 6, 2011. Lessons learned from Flossing Weekly. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies on your PC, Mac, iPad, iPhone, Android device, or TV instantly, all streamed directly to you, saving you time, money, and hassle. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. Hey, this is Aaron Newcomb sitting in again at Floss Weekly, kind of really just sitting in the chair this week because Randal Schwartz is going to be coming on and he's going to be stealing the show for us. He is down at FISL, which is down in Porto Alegre, Brazil. FISL is an open source conference, one of the largest open source conferences in the world. I was down there a couple years ago doing a similar talk to the one that Randal is going to be doing down there, and we're going to show you here in just a minute. But we were doing it's a very large conference, and it attracts about 5,000 people, if you can believe it or not. Just in terms of scale, no pun intended here. When I was down at Scale, the Southern California Linux Expo, they had about 1,800 attendees. So you can see it's a really huge. Open source software is very popular down in Brazil, and extremely friendly people down there as well. I know I had a great crowd for my talk down there, and I'm sure Randal did as well. So we're going to be showing you that the video from his keynote that he did there, and it's all about basically his experiences on Floss Weekly. So yeah, I think he's going to talk, probably about some of the episodes that we've had, and I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about how we do the podcast in case you aren't familiar with that. So it should be very interesting for those of you who are interested in how we do the podcast and kind of some of Randal's thoughts about the show in general, and some of his favorite parts and why we do things certain ways. So I'm sure you're going to want to stay tuned to listen to that in just a second. But first, I want to talk to you about Netflix. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Netflix, and Netflix streams thousands of TV episodes and movies directly to you instantly, which means no more money and hassle, no more late fees, things like that. And there's several easy and instant ways to instantly access streaming movies and TV shows with Netflix. You can watch Netflix movies and TV shows on your Mac, PC, or iPad. That's probably the easiest way. You can also watch on your iPhone and some Android phones too. You can even watch through your gaming console. So if you have a Xbox 360, a PS2, a Wii, you can watch Netflix right on your TV connected to those gaming consoles. If you're not a gamer, you can watch Netflix on your TV with an Apple TV or even a Roku box. It's a great way to watch Netflix. They're inexpensive and easy to use. So with Netflix, you can watch movies and TV shows instantly using any of those devices, and you can begin to watch a movie or a show on one device, which is really cool, and then finish on another device later if you have to get up to go to the bathroom, or the kids are crying, or if you fall asleep, which I do quite often, you can always pick it up on another device later, which is great. Whichever way you choose to access Netflix, you can watch as many movies or TVs as you want, anytime you want, and you can cancel anytime, which is great. You're not locked in for a year or more. So go to Netflix and try it for 30 days free. Just go to netflix.com/twit. And be sure to use that URL when you sign up for your free trial. That's netflix.com/twit. And we thank Netflix for their support of Twit and Floss Weekly. And we hope hope you enjoy watching all your movies and TV shows instantly on Netflix. All right. So now let's kick it over to Randal down at FISL and for his keynote down there. Let's take a look.
I'm then going to refer to many of the recurring themes and observations that we've made by doing all these shows. And just for a bit of fun, I'm going to look behind the scenes and tell you how we produce the show. You might be curious if some of you, especially if you want to get into podcasting, it would be interesting to find out. So podcast itself has been running since April of 2006. It's quite a long time for a podcast, back towards the early days. And as the name implies, Floss Weekly, it's a weekly show. In the beginning and early on, it was occasionally missed. Didn't get there all the time, but we're pretty much on a weekly schedule now. And in fact, this week when I'm here, I have a co-host that takes over for me. So the show is still remaining weekly even when I'm not around to do it. It's a 1-hour show, and I really try to aim for no more than 1 hour. I want to be respectful of people's time that are listening to the show on a regular basis, because I know I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I don't want them to keep running to 2.5 hours when they started out as an hour. Yes, I'm looking at you this week in tech, for all the people that are watching at home there. And it's a 45-minute interview. So we basically start out with me and the co-host chatting about various things that have happened since last week. Not a lot, just a little bit of chat back and forth. And then we do a 45-minute interview with our guest or guests. And then we wrap up the show by talking about what we just heard about, and then also talking about what's coming up in upcoming shows. And I also then put in a little plug for where I'm going to be next. Like for the last few weeks, I've been saying I'm coming here to FISL. And so just to let people know where me and the co-host are going to be at. It comes out in both audio and video formats. Most of our subscribers listen to it by audio, so I always make sure that the guests know that so they don't just hold up something to the screen and say, and here we have this. I want people to talk about what they're seeing, so it makes it possible for people to listen in their cars and while they're working out and things like that. But the video format has actually become somewhat popular, so we do both a small and a large format of that, a small for easy download, large for higher resolution. We tape it live. You can actually watch the show while we tape it. It's at 9:30. I don't remember the time of my podcast. 9:30 a.m. on Wednesdays, U.S. West Coast time. And that varies between 4 and 6 hours from Brazil time, but you can watch it anytime there in that. We have live video feeds so you can actually watch. We show the whole show even behind the scenes while we're taping it. There's nothing hidden. We don't just show the resulting product. You actually get to see us set up and chat with the guests and things. And people find that interesting to actually watch it go out. There's also an IRC channel. So I'm watching many screens at once while I'm trying to do the show. But there's an IRC channel that the guests can even get questions from. So I'm watching that. I'm watching our back chat. I'm watching the video feed. It's awfully complex, but I seem to be up to it most of the time. It's a really popular show. I don't know the exact number recently, but I've been told that the monthly downloads are in the 6-figure region. That means 100,000 to 1 million downloads. So I believe, I don't know that for a fact, but nobody's challenged me on this, that it's the most downloaded open source podcast out there. So I cover a lot of range of stuff, and things are pretty good that way. It's not a free show to do, though, in the sense that Leo Laporte, who runs the Twit network, has to pay the people that are in Petaluma to both manage the show flow from their end and also to edit the show and to publish the show. The production costs, when we don't have a sponsor, are paid for out of Leo's pocket. He actually sponsors the show in that sense because it costs money, and it costs money out of his pocket to do this. But we occasionally have ads, and it's somewhat controversial to have ads on a show that in the first place, but we have to pay the cost somehow. And we do have high integrity about the ads, though. I will not advertise anything I don't personally use. So like we've been running Netflix recently for a little while because I use Netflix when I'm traveling to be able to watch television shows and movies and stuff. And so and I get complaints occasionally, your Netflix doesn't work on Linux, but I can't do anything about that. We have to subsidize the cost of the show somehow because I don't expect Leo to pay for it forever out of his pocket. Okay. Now, I actually got involved by being a guest. When the show first started, Chris DeBono, who some of you might have met, he works for Google as the FLOSS liaison to take care of open source software within Google. He started the show, and then Leo Laporte got me into podcasting. I started doing a podcast for one of my other hats that I wear, which is going on cruises, scientific cruises, and I started doing a weekly podcast about that. So when Leo was on as a guest on my podcast, I asked him after the taping, I said, well, why haven't I been on FLOSS Weekly yet? And so Leo said, oh, well, we'll just have to get you set up. And there I was on episode 9. So I was actually a guest on the show very early on. And it was great because, a lot of people know me about Perl, but we actually talked about a lot of different things. So it was more of a personality exploration rather than just being a straight on-topic show. And I kind of like that format. That's a lot of what we do with our current guests. I don't always ask entirely about the project they're working on. I sometimes ask, how did you get into open source software? What else is crazy about you that people might not know that you might want people to know? So on. So it's really a varied show. And The show stalled after 17 episodes. We call that pod fade. The podcast went away and didn't come back. And it's mostly because Chris ran out of time. Chris DeBona, well, Chris didn't have a baby. His wife had a baby, but you know what I mean. He got involved with a baby, so there was a problem there. So right around the time that it started to go away, I started being a guest on Leo's television show that was filmed in Canada called Lab with Leo. And during one of the breaks, I said, hey, what's up with Floss? Are you ever going to bring Floss Weekly back? And Leo figured out, Leo told me about Chris and not having time anymore. So Leo said, well, tell you what, you can help me. Bring me some guests and you can co-host. I thought, well, that's a great opportunity because I know that the rest of Leo's network, people really tune into those things on a regular basis. It's really a big opportunity. So I put together the first show a few months after that in July of 2007. And I believe the first one was Postgres. After that, it took a little time for me to get to weekly. It actually took about a year for me to get it up to weekly because I had to keep finding people to come on the show, and I had to keep working out my time and Leo's time and figure out how to make that all coordinate together. Now, one interesting thing happened a couple years later is that we had John O'Bacon, who was the community manager for Ubuntu, on one of the shows, and even before he was coming on the show, we had a phone conversation about how the show would actually work. And he said, well, if you ever need to fill in, you need somebody else to take over the position instead of doing it yourself. He says, I've done podcasting and stuff before. And I said, wow, that's pretty cool. So we actually invited Jono, after being on as a guest, to come on and as often as he could regularly co-host as well. And that was a really great era because anything that I knew from sort of the programming side, I didn't know much about desktops and Linux and things like that. So he would fill in those sorts of technical questions. And then Leo would ask questions that were more about general knowledge and how to get involved and things like that. So we all had our own specialty, and it really worked out well for the show. But then there was some more shuffling around in mid-2010. The time slot got moved. Leo kept adding shows to his network, and my slot ended up getting pushed down to the morning time. And because it went from Wednesday afternoon to Wednesday morning, and Leo went on to other projects, I had to be shifted to being the host as well as the producer. Now, since I had done probably 60 shows, 70 shows at that point, I was pretty comfortable taking the hosting slot, so it wasn't bad at all. I sort of learned the little tips and tricks the way Leo does the show, and I said, yeah, I could take the host slot, that'll work. But the sad thing was that John O'Bacon wasn't available for that time slot. It turns out that all of his mornings are committed making phone calls to Europe for the rest of the Ubuntu organization, so he has no morning time available at all. So then I said, oh, what do I do? What am I going to do now? I need to have somebody to bounce my thoughts off. If it's just me talking and then me talking to the guest, it's not as fun of a show, really. I've done a few of those. They're not as fun. So I figured it took a lot of people to fill Jono's shoes. So I had 5 people being the co-host after Jono left. So my co-hosts include former guests in general. Aaron Newcomb was twice a guest before he became one of the rotating co-hosts. We had Aaron Segal. He was co-host for some shows, but he's been too busy lately to be on the co-host list. Also, he was a former guest. Randy Freebius Girl Harper has also been a former guest, and now she regularly co-hosts with me. Simon Phipps, who is in the audience, yay Simon, thank you, has twice been a guest, and then has also been a regular co-host for the show, and occasionally hosts, so it's all good. Dan Lynch is particularly. He was the host of Linux Outlaws, which is another great podcast, by the way. When people ask me, why aren't you more of a news show? Why are you staying a magazine show? Why don't you do more timely things? I say, go listen to Linux Outlaws. They do 2 hours of that every week. I don't need to do that. And so it's really great when Dan gets to cross over and be on my show as well, because he occasionally interjects some interesting news that I might not have been aware of. And I'd also been a guest on their show, too, which is how the relationship actually started. So it took 5 people to fill Jono's slots, and I keep Jono's shoes, I should say. And I want to, Jono has a standing offer to come back anytime he wants as well, but he hasn't had the time again. Now, in doing these shows, there's so many great shows in the series. I get complimented all the time on the kind of caliber of guests and stuff that we've had. But if I had to narrow it down to what I think were probably the most interesting shows, like if now you're just finding out about Floss Weekly for the first time and want to go back and listen to it, I'm going to give you a tip. I'll give you the 10 most interesting people that we've chatted with and a little bit of why. And I'm also going to give you the 10 most interesting projects I've had. So it's just 20 shows out of 117. You don't have to listen to all of them. Okay, we had Fernanda Wyden on one of the really early shows. You all know her. She's running around here helping to run the conference. But she had great perspective. Oh, she's over there. She's waving at me. Okay, there we go. So you can listen to her on a podcast. Show number 22. it was great because she talked about open source in general, the open source movement in Brazil, and also about women in open source and women in general in technology. And it was a really fun show to do, and one of my favorites. Dan Ingalls is one of the co-founders of the Smalltalk programming language. And from Smalltalk, we get everything involved with windows and mice and displays and things like that. So to have Dan, who was one of the founders of this notion of having windows and mice move around things, and to create a language that was simple and yet powerful like Smalltalk, to have him on, he was truly a pioneer in the industry, and really fun to chat with him. We had Simon Phipps on. I already introduced him earlier as one of our co-hosts, but Simon has a very interesting way of looking at open source communities and especially the relationship of open source to commercial operations. And it was just fun to listen to him discuss that. That's one of the milestone shows. By the way, the show number is what you're seeing on the left-hand side, show number 22, show number 29, and so on. So that's there. Of course, Jono was a great guest, as well as being a good co-host, and just listening to him talk about the Ubuntu community and how that was all about. And also, this was when he was writing his book, The Art of Community, and so he was promoting that within this podcast as well. So, again, a great guest. Tim O'Reilly, who I've known for 20 years now, because I wrote the first Programming Perl book and the Learning Perl book and a bunch of other ones, and they were all published by Tim's company. But Tim also had a great thing to say, a great bit of things to say. This is about the time when the notion of open data was really huge. I mean, it's not that it's disappeared now, but it was just coming into light. Like, if you have all your data locked up in Google, how do you get it back out? If you have all your data locked up in Facebook, how do you get it back out? And he has a lot of really interesting things to say about having open data as part of our agreements and arguments. David DHH, I don't want to pronounce his middle name, but DHH is the creator or co-creator of Rails. And that was an interesting show because he's very opinionated. And so it was fun trying to ask him questions to try to get sort of like back to the main part of the story. I also pointed out it's one of the few shows. Okay, yeah, I'm speaking way too fast. I'm much more excited now than I was a few minutes ago. Sorry for the translation, people. Okay, DHH was the first show that I actually had to consider bleeping. Because if some of you have seen DHH to speak, about every fifth word needs to be, censored. But we let the show out as is, because we're adults. We figure adults are listening to our show, and that's enough. So, but it was complex for that reason. And of course, no list like this would be incomplete or would be complete without Linus Torvalds. The Linus show was actually really hard to do. We had originally scheduled to use the Wi-Fi in the hotel where the conference was happening. But as many of you know, if you're in the same hotel as where a conference is happening, the Wi-Fi tends to go through the floor. It's just horrible. And so we were already all set up. I had a co-host, I had Linus, I had me, and we had a support person on the other side. And we were ready to go. We were trying to call in to the cottage where we had ended the show to get it to happen, and it couldn't make a connection. So I wasn't going to miss the opportunity, though, so we actually had an offline conversation. It disappointed many of the people who had tried to tune in live so they could ask questions, but that's how it goes. And he was a fun guest. It was a lot of fun to chat with him about the history of Linux and stuff, probably something he's answered 10 or 20 times before, but we had him on there as well. For my 100th show, I brought back Chris DeBona. And this was fun because he got to update us on Google Summer of Code and where Google was at with open source, and also just to chat about where the show has gone since he left it 93 shows earlier. So that was a really great interview as well. I really appreciate Chris coming back on the show for our number 100 show. And if you want to find out more about FreeBSD Girl than you would have found out by just listening to her as a co-host, we did a whole show with her. So she has an interesting background of how she got into software and what it's like to be a girl a woman, sorry, in open source. And so she's contributed as well to that subject. But I think the one in this list, if you could pick only one, and I say it for very important reasons, we had Bob Jacobson on. Bob Jacobson had been, as I recall, sued for releasing software that another company claimed it had the patent on. But the other company, I believe, I'll say, did some really sleazy things to make sure that their patent filing appeared to be before his use of the software. So it looked like he was sort of copying after the fact. And there was a lot of dirty deeds and tricks and stuff. And similar to some things that most of you may know about me, he had to pay a lot of money out of his pocket, on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars, to defend himself in court for just releasing free software that he wasn't even the originator of. He was just a shepherd of it at that point. So in terms of understanding why software patents are bad, why the U.S. legal system is kind of messed up, and maybe some examples for you, if maybe Brazil can do it the right way instead of the way we now have it all messed up on, I would really urge you to listen to the Bob Jacobson Show. Now, on the other side, I have a bunch of favorite projects, and again, for various reasons. And again, we've got 10 of these. For episode 26, I did SQLite. Richard Hipp came on to talk about his project, SQLite. One of the things I found out during that show is that SQLite is in pretty much every smartphone. I know it's in the iPhone because there's a data service available for iOS, and it's in all the other smartphones. So this actually makes SQLite the #1 database in the world. Most people might think it's MySQL, but no, it's SQLite. It's the #1 database in the world in terms of number of installations because it's in everybody's smartphone. And Richard Hipp was also fascinating to talk to because of his release model. He said the license for SQLite is basically public domain. In other words, it's not even under one of the standard OSI licenses. He just says, take it, just use it. I don't care, just use it. And his income model was sort of interesting as well. I said, well, how do you make money if you're just working on SQLite all the time? And he goes, well, a very large phone manufacturer is using SQLite as their entire data structure internally. So rather than having a file system inside and then store files and then have some of them be a database, the actual data is entirely within an SQLite instance. So they pay him to make sure that SQLite stays up to date and does everything they want it to do. So that's his income model. And there was a talk yesterday about all the different possible income models for open source. And this it was just amazing to me about how many different ways you don't have to be a starving artist with SQLite. I actually have some more to say about that later. But amazing guy, so casual, so laid back too, just so unassuming, and yet he's made this huge impact on open source. Another project that's also really important to me was MyFOS. MyFOS is the microfinancing system which is allowing small microloans to be made to developing nations, to be made to people of the developing nations. And the software that they use to do that is all open source. And before that, they were just simply tracking it in like Excel spreadsheets and stuff. But this made it possible for communities to come together and get microloans into the hands of people that could use them. Maybe $20 to go buy some material so they could make some clothes and then resell those again and actually create a living out of doing these microloans. Very moving project. jQuery is probably the #1 JavaScript library in use today. It's on everybody's big sites, at least in the U.S. I don't know how it's happened down here, but at least in the U.S. it's like everywhere. We had John Resig, the inventor of jQuery, on, and he was a very colorful guy, very fun to talk to. And I kind of wondered why jQuery sort of felt natural for me, and then I found out that Resig was an avid Perl programmer before that. So he designed jQuery a little bit like Perl on the inside, which was sort of why it felt really natural for me. But again, fun show to listen to, fun show to interview people for. Ole Nepal, this was probably one of my most unusual interviews. The gentleman whose name I now no longer remember, sorry, in Nepal that was responsible for deploying the one laptop per child laptops was able to talk to me, and his time zone was something like 13.5 time zones from me. So we had to find a time and a half. That was the weird part, and a half. But he had to figure the time. Then I finally figured out that if I wake up at 4 in the morning, I could talk to him about the time he was going to bed. So that worked out pretty well. And it was also just me interviewing him directly. But the key things that I got out of that were just the power of having access to the internet for these small schools, for these rural schools, developing schools. He was bringing in just a single 56K line to the entire school. The laptops would all mesh together so that he didn't have to wire anything up in the actual building. But they were looking at things like Wikipedia. So they were like reading Wikipedia to get more information. And even though it's just a single 56K line, Wikipedia, mostly text, is pretty easy to download it with that. And so we had students cooperating. They had students cooperating and collaborating and just enjoying working with each other. And it was really, really moving to hear the impact that this technology was having from someone who's been right on the front line. And that was a great show, really great show. OpenStreetMap's another very important project for empowering the world. We had a couple guys who've been working with OpenStreetMaps for a long time, and we had them on the show talking about what actually is happening. I had not been aware of just how OpenStreetMaps worked, and to be able to hear this directly from the people that are helping produce it, really good stuff. You know, it's funny, I have an iPhone app that allows me to download OpenStreetMaps, so when I'm offline, I'm not on your data grid here, I'm on, you know, just in the US, and so I can download like the whole map of where are we at? Puerto Alegre, and have it so I can walk around without getting lost, without worrying about where I'm at, so I can use that while I'm offline. Without OpenStreetMaps, that probably wouldn't be possible. I know the big commercial maps wouldn't allow me to do that kind of offline loading. Another fun show was MakerBot. One of the key players in MakerBot, whose name Bree something Bree? Anyway, he was on the show, and it was a lot of fun to talk about how these machines ultimately could probably make themselves and just continue to replicate themselves. So he'd been involved in this project for a long time. He also talked about these maker spaces, hacker spaces around at least around the US. I don't know if you have them here, but where people can come and tinker with stuff. And it was really fun to hear about how that all exists out there in the world. So a lot of fun there too. One of my favorite shows was the Mars rover drivers. This came about with a special connection that I had because of the cruises I've been on. But we were able to get the lead rover driver and one of his assistants on the show. And you may think, well, what connection does this have with open source? Well, not a lot, except it's interesting to see how much open source software they were using to make this all happen. And the best moment, I think, though, and you hear me like laugh out of control at one point in the show, is I asked how much Perl was being used there. And he says, well, you wouldn't believe it, but he says, sometimes we make mistakes when we send out commands. We send out a command that, although we've checked it out in the laboratory, the command, when we actually see it, causes the thing to spin a little bit more than it should be, or something happens that's wrong. Every time we make a mistake, we take the pattern of that mistake and we put it into a giant Perl program that we run as a test on every subsequent upload. It has to pass through this Perl program before it gets sent over to the rover. So Perl was being used in an out-of-this-world mission-critical application. I thought that was pretty amazing. I just couldn't stop grinning at that point. You hear me just go silent on this code. So that was a lot of fun to be able to chat with those guys. And sorry about Spirit dying. That's too bad. Okay. Rakudo Perl 6, speaking of Perl again, show number 140. This was a one-on-one interview that I did with Patrick Michaud, who is the head coordinator for the activity on Rakudo, which is one of the 3 or 4 implementations of Perl 6 currently in progress. I found that show quite fascinating because actually I didn't know that Perl 6 had come along that far. There actually is a workable version of Rakudo that you can download and invoke. The biggest problem right now, there's some problem with speed because it's still a little bit early in the cycle. But the biggest problem is the CPAN isn't there yet. And so as soon as something like the CPAN comes about where we can start having more modules to work with Perl 6, it'll actually be a production-ready system. It's very close to that already. Probably I would say the current version of Rakudo could qualify as a beta for Perl 6. So it's getting very close there. So somebody who have been saying Perl 6 will never come here. No, it's very, very, very close. And I found out by talking to the guy that's in charge. Another show that was really fun for me to do and also is fun to watch and listen to. This one you got to watch, though. You can't just listen to it because there's so much video going on in this show. OpenPilot. These guys are taking programmable, taking and making programmable flight devices like helicopters and airplanes and things like that. And they have software. It's very complex to control a helicopter in the air. But the software they have goes in between the control sticks and the actual helicopter. So you just say, go up 3 feet, and it just does it, and then holds there, and it's stable. And then you say, now go forward 50 feet, and it just does that, and then it stops, and it's stable. It has sensors in it to tell where it is. It even has a mini GPS in it, so they can do larger things. It can hold up to 2 or 3 pounds, which means you could actually fly a camera over a neighborhood and get your own version of Google Street View or Google Sky. Very fun stuff. It's still sort of in progress. Well, everything is sort of in progress, right? But it's really, really great. It was a lot of fun. And actually, he said he's going to send me one of those things when it gets a little more developed. So you won't see me for a while after that. That'll be great. Actually, I'll probably be annoying my neighbors more than I should be. And finally, at least important in the U.S., one of the organizations that is interested in open data is Sunlight Labs. Sunlight Labs are working with the U.S. government and regional agencies in the U.S. government to make sure that all the data about things like elections and voting and things that happen in committees and stuff are available on a timely basis so that we as citizens can be informed about what's going on. They're only in the U.S. right now, but maybe if you have similar interests here in Brazil, you might want to check out that show to see how they sort of got started and how the processes and maybe some of the difficulties that they went through. But I think if you look at this list, this really shows that we have an amazing impact with open source throughout the real world. It's not just about us being able to run a free desktop and things like that. It's actually about a lot of real things are happening with open source out in the communities. Now, as I'm doing the show, there's a lot of recurring themes that seem to come over and over again. And I'll talk about each of these in a little more detail in a second. But the first one is scratch your own itch, share for feedback, share to build community, no need to starve, that's an important one, no need to be near each other while you're doing it, no age limit, important point I'll talk about in a minute there, no limit to what kinds of applications you can do. I'm going to talk about the good and bad things about forks, and also wrap it up with selecting the right license. So these are the recurring themes that we keep seeing over and over again as I'm interviewing all these people for the show. In terms of scratching your own itch, what that means is that I have a problem, I want to solve it for myself. So I write the code that solves it for myself. So, and many projects that we talk to report that this is how they start. One guy or a couple of guys gets together and says, oh, I really would like this thing to do that, and it doesn't do that yet. So someone solves a problem for themselves, and then they share a solution with others. And the reason sharing your solution with others works is because typically if you've got a problem, other people will probably have the same problem, unless you're really, really unique. Now, the good thing about this is that being your own first customer brings you focus. In other words, by being the person developing the code for yourself, you already know what the problem is, and you focus on just coming to the solution. And the sharing also works because it's likely that if you have that problem, then others do too. Now, by being open source, by being free software, it means that others can help you do some of the coding, others can help you fix it, but more importantly, I think, is that they can customize the solution for their own itch. Because again, you might not have exactly the same problem as somebody else, but maybe you have a similar problem. And so this allows them to do that. Share for feedback. By making your code open source, by making your code free and sharing it, it means you get to have feedback. People can comment on it. They can comment on your design. It might be that you're trying the hard way to do a particular application. So by having it open source, people can share that out there and get feedback on that. We heard many projects that talked about, we posted this out on the net, and all of a sudden people were saying, oh, you should just use this particular library instead. Feedback on coding. In other words, maybe the actual code needs to be done a different way. Real important one, feedback on security. A lot of us are not security experts, so it's good to have your code published so that other people who know about security can say, oh, if you do that, then all they have to type is 1, 2, 3, and they'll be root on your system. You need to be able to have that kind of feedback out there. Of course, remember, when the good guys can see it, the bad guys can too. Feedback on compatibility. Maybe you're doing something that if you just did it a slightly different way, somebody else could use the software to work with something else. I've heard a lot of talks today even about that sort of thing, and we find out a lot about compatibility by putting stuff out in public. Also getting feedback on the documentation. This is wrong, I don't understand this, there's not enough tutorial on this, there's not enough reference material on this. And also feedback that results in more resources. Wow, I didn't know somebody was working on this. Now I can work on it with you as well. So sharing for feedback seems to be a common theme in a lot of the projects. Once the projects got big enough to start sharing it out with other people, it went way beyond wherever they expected. That's typically what they were talking about. And so being in public can also build community, because you're going to bring together people and groups that have similar problems. Now, one thing we kept seeing over and over again is the projects that were the most successful had a lot of easy-to-use communication channels. So they have, for example, their code repo was in the public, their bug tracker was in public. They had good mailing lists set up, good forums set up, IRC channels that they sit on 24/7, that sort of thing. So by having those sorts of things out there, the community was able to connect with each other and find each other and be able to cooperate a lot better. So the biggest projects always had many of these channels in place. Blogs for news items. So in other words, having some place where people can regularly find out, well, what's the latest with this? Like the Perl 6 community has a blog that's updated about every other day with something that's happening that's going on. Even podcasts. Some of the bigger projects had podcasts. So it's sort of fun interviewing somebody who does a podcast on a podcast because we all kind of know the inside of the story. But that's a great way to share for community as well. And hopefully when you hear about how simple it is for us to do FLOSS Weekly, you'll be able to be inspired to maybe try one for your community as well. Also, no need to starve. You know, free software with the overloaded meaning of free in English is no cost. It's true. But it doesn't mean that your time has to be. It doesn't mean that you have to starve just because you're working on free software. One of the many things I try to do in almost every show is to ask the person, is this just a labor of love, or are you making money with this? And if you're making money, how? How are you making money giving away free software? So we hear a lot of different things. You can get paid to do a lot of different things by the right kind of people that need something to happen. For example, somebody might want you to add features to your software, and they're willing to pay you for it because otherwise it won't get done. People are willing to pay to fix bugs and get support. That's really handy. I get paid a lot to teach Perl. I give Perl away for free, but people pay me to teach them. Write documentation. I get a little bit of money from that as well. So you don't have to starve just because you're working on an open source project. And one thing that's recurring, and I bet Simon's going to grimace at me here, but build premium versions. In other words, have sort of an open core and then have another set of projects that we sell for people that want more support or more features in it. You know, it's an option. You don't have to take it, but it's an option. Another thing we kept hearing is that a lot of these projects were geographically diverse. In other words, it wasn't just a bunch of people in the same city in the US getting together. It was people all over the world typically working on these things. And also these projects, they tended to use very heavily things like email and IRC. So to be able to chat immediately through IRC, to be able to send email on mailing lists and so on. Very useful tools. And some projects that were big enough started having global or regional meetups, like the conferences and stuff every year for these projects. And many projects have local users groups. So even though they are separated globally, they tended to have local groups as well, especially the larger projects. So there's no need to be near just to be on an open source project. Now, on the internet, nobody knows you're 15, if you are. Okay, that's really convenient. You know, this is the phrase on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. Well, no one knows you're 15 either, okay? Unless you have to sign some sort of legal document to contribute to a project, which they do have some in the firm. And I think the thing that best pointed this out is Compiz, which is the windowing software that's built into the latest versions of Debian, is it? One of those. Anyway, Compiz. I forget. I should go back and listen to the show. We found out he started at age 13. You know, he started to contribute, started commits and everything at age 13, and now he's like 20 or something, 19 or 20, and he's still like the lead contributor to it, the lead manager for it. And of course, as an old graybeard that I am, this inspires me. You know, it really is amazing the power of youth and the energy of youth, and to be able to have young contributors on projects and have them make a difference is really, really inspiring for me. There's also no limit to the kinds of applications we can do. Every kind of software seems to have a FLOSS version available to it, and like the Mars rover project, you know, literally out of this world. You know, because we've talked to people who have done desktop applications all over the place, operating systems, you know, like Linus and things like that, with OpenBSD, FreeBSD, and so on. Embedded software, a lot of people, we interviewed the Arduino people and the OpenPilot people, you know, things that were putting software into systems. Languages, people building languages out there. We've got a lot of language designers and developers on it. And even what I like to call enterprisey stuff. When your organization gets big enough that you have to have some stuff behind the scenes to manage it all, it's really great that a lot of these things are now becoming open source software. We've interviewed a number of companies that are making available very, very large-scale things with open source. So, and it has to get done, so it gets done. Another thing is we've interviewed a number of projects that have had to fork or recently forked or are thinking about forking. So open source, of course, means you can fork. It means you can spread out another copy of the project and take away some of the developers to work on the new thing. But I would like to argue against doing it lightly. For example, if you're just having some sort of disagreement at the top level, you should really try to work that out first, because forking because you have an ego war with somebody else is generally not going to go very well. It's going to be a bad thing for everybody, unless it turns into a good thing. You know, the reason we have OpenBSD today, which is still probably the most secure open source operating system out there, or one of the, I'll say, is because the creator, Theo, had an argument with the people in the, I believe it was the NetBSD project, or was it the FreeBSD, one of the two. And he went off on his own. And now we have this really high-level, high-quality operating system that has had very few remote exploits in the existence of its entire project. And the reason that forking is bad is because it dilutes the project size. You sort of had to get to a critical mass before you have a working open source project anyway. And so if you fork, you're kind of splitting that in two, or maybe 60-40 or 70-30. It's going to be a problem when you distribute that. And also, if you're just a user of the software and then the project forks, it sometimes gets a little confusing for everybody. Do I follow this version or do I follow that version now? What do I do with that? But the good thing about forking is that it might protect people's interest in the case of something that is happening to the ownership of the software. In fact, many recent projects have had to fork to continue. We just interviewed the guys from Jenkins, which was originally Hudson, working with, and because of some stuff that happened, he had to fork the project and become something entirely new. We've also interviewed the guys with Drizzle, which is a fork from MySQL. I think you can see the pattern there. But it's great that because the open source license permits forking to happen generally, it means that projects can out-survive even something hostile at the top level. Selecting the right license. Two broad categories I'll talk about just to kind of put the endpoints out there. GPL-style restrictive license actually has sort of a two-tier approach, and that is that the copyright holder, the original creator of the software, has all the freedoms, but gives everybody that uses it less freedom, but equal. And so the guarantee there is that everybody who uses the software other than the original owner has identical freedom. Now, but you got to keep in mind it's a two-tier system. The owner always has a lot more rights than everybody else. So you'd like to say it's all equal, but it's not equal. The owner has the first rights. Okay? Whereas the BSD-style permissive licenses is that every licensee has all the freedom of the original author. It doesn't create that first-tier step. But that also includes the freedom not to pass that along. So they're both free licenses, but in different directions. One of them says, everybody after me stands in the same pool. The other one says, the next one after me is just like me. So it just depends on how you want to look at what kind of license you want. And there's not one better than the other. I've been occasionally called to task for saying that I really prefer the BSD license. And the reason is simple for me, because of the arena that I'm working in. GPL, first to give it credit there, guarantees that patches, mostly guarantees that patches flow back. If people that are using your software figure out that something's broken, they generally will end up giving you the patches back. But I'll tell you, if what you want is for your software to be used in as many places as possible, a BSD-style license is it's what's going to do that. I've worked for many companies that would not allow GPL software into their environment for fear of tainting because of the viral effect. And I know that it may be an irrational fear, but in practice, it happens. So if you really want your code to be used everywhere, the BSD license guarantees more of that. If you want your code to be shared equally amongst all the users, the GPL license guarantees that. So it really tends to pick what you want, a smaller, coherent audience, or do you want it just to be used everywhere? And I'll have to say both models, our projects that we've had on FLOSS Weekly, we've had both models be very successful. So it's not one over the other in terms of making that happen. So let me spend just a few minutes talking about how we actually produce the show, and also how we involve the audience, because if you're going to start a podcast, you'll probably want to know some of this stuff. And then a question that I get occasionally, which is, why some of these things aren't hardcore FLOSS? Why do I use an Apple laptop, for example? Why do we use Skype? I'll get into that in a second. So one of the hard parts early on for me was trying to get guests, trying to figure out who was going to be on the show. And initially, there were people that I knew. Now, I've been in the open source community, many different communities within open source, for a lot of time. So I have made a lot of friends. I've been a speaker at a lot of conferences, which lets me kind of hang out in the speakers' lounges. So I get to meet a lot of people that way, too, people I might not have met in the other way. But it started wearing out. I was like through my, the second tier list and the third tier list, trying to figure out who else to put on the show. So I said, okay, in the show, I asked if anybody wanted to have a particular project on the show, they could just email me, merlin@stonehenge.com. And boy, was that a bad idea, because everybody flooded me with their favorite projects then. At first, it wasn't bad. It started to trickle in, but then I was getting maybe 2 or 3 projects a day. And the worst thing was that there was a lot of duplicate requests. Now, I have probably about 3 hours a week that I can dedicate to FLOSS Weekly, of which an hour and a half of that is actually producing the show, actually being on the show. So that with that other hour and a half a week that I can actually focus on this, I didn't want to be spending time doing overhead stuff. So I got smart. I set up a Google Doc spreadsheet. where I have the project name and what status they are as far as the public is concerned. And that really helped because I could start sending people there and saying, okay, if it's not on that list, then go ahead and ask me. And it's also great because now that Google Doc spreadsheet serves as a working schedule for us, the hosts and co-hosts, so we can actually tell who's coming up and what their status is and who's actually going to be co-host and so on. But again, even though I started having the spreadsheet out there, it was a bit of a problem because people, again, would still send in just a project request. And that meant that I had to go trace down where to find the project, who the contact people are, and so on. It was just a mess. So I've now restricted it even further, just to save my time, just to save my energy so I can focus on really selecting the best possible guests. I tell people in the show, have the project contact me. In other words, if you want an open source project to be on FLOSS Weekly, it's really simple. Have the project leader email me, merlin@stonehenge.com, and they'll get on the show. Now, having said that, I still have 150 people in the backlog of people that have contacted me. So I could do FLOSS daily with this many people and still not get through it for a year. It's just a lot of people to get through. So about once a quarter, I open up 13 slots, and I send out about 35 emails, and I get about 13 responses by the time that's done, and that's how we schedule it. Another thing I like to do with this show is to make sure that the audience participates, to make sure that we have people that know about the show and know who's coming on and stuff. So we set up a Twitter and Identica accounts so they can be posted to, so we can announce things. They're actually both fed from Posterous blog, so posterous.com, FLOSS Weekly, posterous.com. Whatever's posted there also immediately tweets and immediately sends Identica notices out. And this has been great to make sure that people stay up to date. And it's also good because I don't have to give out the password to the Twitter or the Identica account to my other co-hosts. All they have to do is be able to post on the Posterous blog, and it automatically does the tweeting. I used to do this all through my own Twitter account at Merlin. But apparently I found out not everybody wants to read like what I had for lunch and where I've been recently, because I do Foursquare and all the other kinds of check-in things. And so I set up these accounts to be able to post just FLOSS Weekly information to that. And the way I know that not everybody wants to know what I'm eating for lunch but just wanted the FLOSS Weekly announcements is I lost about 100 people from my Twitter account the very first week that I announced these. So everybody moved over to the Twitter. I mean, the Twitter's got probably about 500 people subscribed to it now. But what I do with that is I announce the guests as soon as they're booked. This is great because as soon as I know that somebody's going to be on the show, even if it's 10 or 15 weeks out, people start paying attention. They go, oh, you're going to have them on? Oh, that's cool. And that starts getting blogged and tweeted and everything. So people start to find out about the guests that we're going to have on. I also, the week of the show, I reconfirm with my guest to make sure he still knows he's going to be on. And once I get that confirmation in my hand, then they go ahead and announce it. And then we announce it there. I also announce the live broadcast. There's a lot of people that do that as well. There's a Twitter handle called TriCaster that announces when the show actually is about to go on. But I announce it also under FLOSS Weekly so that we can tell that where somebody can go to tune in and so on. In terms of our workflow, I'm not going to talk much about the sort of low-level production things, but I'll point you to Linux Outlaws show number 200. They did a really great job of talking about the kind of equipment they use, the kind of places, the kind of stuff that they work on to make it all happen. So just pretend we do the same thing because it's pretty close. Okay, but I do want to talk about what we do during the taping. We have Skype that's going between the cottage and the participants. The cottage is in Petaluma. It's the home of the TWiT network, and we Skype from all directly to there. So each host and guest has an individual Skype call to a video switcher built on TriCaster, and they do all the mixing there. The mix, wherever it comes out, is also fed back to us and be able to be watched on live.twit.tv. So you're actually watching the thing that they're recording. You're watching it about 7 seconds delayed because of the nature of the broadcasting of Ustream and Justin and things like that. But you're actually watching the same thing that I'm watching. I just get to see it about 7 seconds earlier because Skype's faster. The hosts, me and whoever I have for a co-host, we also have a Skype chat channel. And that's sort of good because we can actually then tell each other, well, you take the show now. No, you take the show now. Okay, I've got some more questions to ask. So while in the show you may hear it as, it looks like we're just all really good and professional, it's really just because behind the scenes we've actually told each other, now you're going to ask questions now. Well, before doing that, it was really hard because we both asked questions at the same time because we can't see each other, so we don't know when the next person's about to talk. But it works really well. It's also good because the people at the cottage monitor this channel, so they know that when we're about to switch, so they can get the video switcher set up correctly and put the right subtitles on. I also watch the public IRC channel. I'm just there's just a lot of things going on my screen, but I somehow managed to look at them all. We do say that the guests can watch this, but we advise against it just because it's a bit distracting. And it's also weird, like if I didn't want to ask a question, but somebody else asked it in the chat channel, and then the guest answers it, it's a little weird. So I like to maintain the control there. The other thing we do is a little odd, is we tape the show out of order. By that I mean that we take the show with the middle first. You can see this if you watch us live. We tape the show with the middle first so that the guest is immediately on, we do the interview with them, then we send them away and talk about them behind their back. I mean, we actually talk about what happened in the show, and we talk about whatever's coming up and stuff. We do the whole closing for the show. We then go back and tape the opening. That way I can do an introduction, and I can seem like I've really researched this person, because I'll say, and we're probably going to talk about this and that, and I hear he's into this, you know, and it sounds like I've really done my research, but really it's because we did the whole show already. So it's a nice technique. I stole it from Leo and the way he does the rest of his shows. And it's worked really well. But the out-of-order taping also respects the guest's time. We tell him 9:30 in the morning, you'll be on, and we'll take about 45 minutes of your time. We don't want him to have to wait for us to do the opening first and then go to him. So it works out a lot better that way. And it does make us look brilliant. So that's the important part. Very important. I should have asked at the beginning, how many people have listened to at least one episode of Floss Weekly? Oh, good. A lot of fans. Yay. How many people didn't know about it before this conference? Great. Possible new subscribers. Great. And it is in English, by the way, so hopefully you can hear English. Actually, I guess everybody that raised their hand doesn't have a headset on, so that's good. Okay. I guess I can make that work. The show is mostly live to tape. We don't have a lot of time to edit the show, both in terms of production time before we want to publish, and in terms of it just takes resources to do a lot of editing. The only thing we do with editing is rearrange the pieces so they're in the right order again, and also to, if there's a major flaw, like Skype cuts out on us entirely, or we lose one of the hosts or something, we figure out a way to cut that out. But it's pretty rare that there's any editing. Cottage rearranges pieces, adds the header content. We typically push the audio out the same day, so we tape on Wednesdays, so the airing of the show will be within 3 or 4 hours on that same Wednesday. I don't know how they do it that fast, but somebody's back there doing all that editing. The video typically comes out a day later. I think part of the reason for that is they have to push the content up to the CDNs, like Cachefly and stuff, so it takes time for that to get loaded in. And when the cottage announces that it's on, I retweet that, and I also ask the guests to talk about it in their blogs and in their tweets and stuff like that. That really helps out as well. Okay, now people have asked me why Skype. I'd really, really love to use a FLOSS solution. But as a practical matter, Skype is easy to install for most people. They're pretty good at having that. Most people actually already have it. And the one thing I really like about Skype is that it has a high-performance codec. So that's the thing that turns the video into bits and bits back into video, and audio into bits and bits back into audio. They have a proprietary codec that sounds the best even on limited bandwidth systems. And it also knows how to fall back. If we start losing a little bit of it, somehow it just does the right thing. I really would like there to be a good open source alternative to the quality of the Silk 3 codec, but there's not one that exists yet. I am exploring some alternatives, particularly because Microsoft is buying Skype. I don't know what's going to happen to Skype in the near future. I really want another solution in place for us to use for the whole cottage, not just Floss Weekly, to make sure that we have some other thing. Also, the Skype 5.0 interface sucks, okay? We used to have the video that I was watching was in one place on my screen, and the back chat channel was in another place on the screen. Now I have to choose constantly between one and the other in the same window. And if I'm trying to watch the video to kind of see, when it's my turn to talk, I also have to watch the chat channel to see when it's my turn to talk, or I just get these little numbers notifying me 1, 2, 3, 4. Uh-oh, I've got messages. Now when do I switch, right? I can't do that. It's just horrible. Also, over and over again, we get asked, why is it not OGG? Why do we not have an open data format, especially for a show like Floss Weekly? Well, again, limited resources at the cottage. Like I said, real people getting paid real money are working on this, and we have real bandwidth to pay for. Luckily, most of that is sponsored, but it still has to be managed. So there's limited resources at the cottage, limited resources for bandwidth. And frankly, I do have only limited demand for the open data. Yes, I get requests about once every month or two. It's not, but it's only once every month or two. Given our download numbers, that's a tiny fraction of our audience. Okay, so we really can only afford 1 audio and 2 video streams. And again, sorry about this, but OGG isn't everywhere yet. It isn't on my iPhone. It isn't on a lot of people's MP3 players. It's not everywhere. So if we have to pick something that can pretty much be played everywhere, MP3 and MP4 for those. We have had from time to time experimental feeds where we put the OGG feed up, but the OGG feed will go away, and then I won't get any, nobody will complain for like a month. And it's been broken for a month. So that also tells me that even when we put it up there and we get the 10 or 15 downloads a week out of those, that it's not that important to them. So with limited resources, you know, sorry, that's why it's not OGG. I would love for us to have infinite resources and have it available everywhere in one format that everybody could play that was open data, but not that way so far. And again, just because I'm here and I can say this, why do I use a Mac? I have made my living from open source for 20 years, but because I'm doing this as my living, I don't really have any tinkering time at the end of the day. I just want my system to work. And I know you guys like to tinker with your Linux boxes and your FreeBSD boxes and stuff. I don't want to do that tinkering. That's not me. Okay, my stuff just has to work. I also have to have it integrated to my smartphone. So I use an iPhone and I use a Mac because they work real well together. And it just works better than any solution I've seen in the open source community yet. Now that's the challenge. Get it to work as well as my Mac works with my iPhone, and I will switch. But so far, nothing's out there quite like that yet. They're not perfect, but it's workable. I do use FreeBSD on all my servers. I'm running FreeBSD on 5 different machines in the cloud. They're running a root on ZFS. I really love that. FreeBSD rocks for that. And I have formally run OpenBSD, OpenSolaris, and Linux on my servers. So the only thing that's a Mac is my laptop. And that's only because I have to have it integrate well with my iPhone and work it that way. I do run Mac ports on my Mac, which means that I can use all these open source software. I download and build GNU Emacs every single day. I'm one of the smoke testers to make sure it doesn't break on OS 10. So that's my job. Okay, I have over 300 packages installed on my Mac ports. So in summary, if you want to find out more about the podcast, you can go to twit.tv/floss. I say that so many times in the show, too. We do have dents and tweets coming out from both me and Floss Weekly. You can also follow my personal blog at merlin.posters.com or the Floss Weekly blog at flossweekly.posters.com. And everywhere else, I'm either Merlin or Real Merlin or Randal Schwartz. Just check all 3 of those. One of those is bound to be me. So that's the end of my talk, and thank you for listening.
That was, you know, our normal host, Randal Schwartz, down in Brazil. In case you missed it, he was down in Brazil at the FISL Open Source Conference, FISL, and you heard me talk about that a little bit at the opening of the show. So, so that was pretty neat, and it was great. You know, it was kind of interesting for me too, going back since I've been doing this a while now with Floss Weekly, to go back and listen to some of his favorite. Randal's favorite episodes. The ones where I was a guest, I noticed were not on his favorites list. But some of the ones where I was co-hosting were on that list, and they were some of my favorites as well. So, so that was really kind of interesting to hear, and also, you know, how the podcast is produced. I think, you know, a lot of people, if you watch live, actually, and this is something Randal didn't say, if you watch live, the live stream, you'll actually see how we do it. And it can be quite interesting. A lot of people tune in and have a lot of questions after they watch how one of these podcasts is recorded. They'll ask questions about, oh, how do you do this? How do you do that? And so we get to answer that on IRC. Sometimes I hang around after the show and answer some of those questions. But very interesting. And so, you know, definitely I would say the audience down there is really good, and you know, I'm sure he got a lot of questions after the fact. Some people are shy about asking questions in English if that's not their first language, so I'm sure Randal got a lot of questions after his session was over. All right, so let's talk about what's coming up on Floss Weekly here in the future. Just looking at the schedule here, we have Neil Gompa talking about a nano CMS. I'm not sure if that's a new CMS. It's one that I'm not familiar with anyway, let's put it that way. And then we have Paul Beckingham and Federico Hernandez coming on talking about Task Warrior. That'll be coming up soon. And then we're trying to get together a live OSCON show after that. So I know that Randal's going to be up there and Simon Phipps is going to be up there. So we're going to try to do something from OSCON. We'll see if that works out. And then shortly after that, we've got Colin Percival talking about FreeBSD on EC2. So how to use FreeBSD on Amazon's EC2 system. And then we have some Perry McDowell coming up talking about Delta 3D. That's another one I'm not really familiar with. So maybe I'll have to ask Randal to co-host on that one so I can learn about it. It's actually a lot of fun learning about stuff as I am able to co-host some of these, some of Floss Weekly episodes. So that's what's coming up. If you want, as Randal said, you know, if you want to get your project or a project that you're passionate about into the queue, what you need to do is contact the project leader and have the project leader email Randal directly, and that will get the ball rolling there. And we've got a lot of other episodes already in the queue thanks to the efforts of Randal and Dan as well. Dan Lynch has been doing a lot of work kind of getting these things scheduled up, so thank you to them. Remember to follow at Floss Weekly on Twitter. That's our new Twitter handle. And if you're just interested in the show and not interested in what's Randal's doing or what I'm doing or anybody else, follow Floss Weekly on Twitter, and you'll get that information there. Also, there's a Posterius page about Floss Weekly. I don't have that URL in front of me, but there's a Posterius page where you can kind of follow all that goes on as well. Now, if you're interested in what I'm doing, you can always follow me on Twitter or Facebook. I'm at Aaron Newcomb on those sites. New episode of my podcast was just released on Maker Faire. I know it's a little late, but I promised I would get that done in time for this week, so that is out right now. The downloads are not available, but you can watch it streaming on my site. That's thesourceshow.org. Go to thesourceshow.org and you'll see the new podcast there all about Maker Faire, which I interviewed the creator of Architect, which is a really neat show about where they use Tesla coils and make music. It's pretty incredible. Grant Imahara from Mythbusters is on that. Did a short interview with him, which was pretty nice to meet him. He's a really nice guy, as well as lots of other stuff. So definitely go check that out. So that's it for this week. Be sure to tune in every Wednesday at this time or download the podcast either in audio or video format. And until next week, thanks for watching. That's it for this episode of Floss Weekly.